The gospel reading is as follows. And early in the morning, Jesus came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" And they were saying this, testing him, in order that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, and he was left alone and the woman where she was in the midst. And straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, sin no more." This is the word of the Lord. John 8, 2-11. First, a word to those of you who may be wondering. You are the ones whose Bibles place these verses, this passage, this story, in parentheses, or at the end of the Gospel of John, or perhaps in a footnote. You may be wondering what the deal is, given that we all know the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery. Therefore, we have generally assumed this is just part of the Bible. It's part of the Bible like any other part. Here's the short answer, and it will likely be more than you wanted to know, but as they say, in the interest of full disclosure, here we go. In the most ancient manuscripts of Scripture, this passage is not always present. That's right. The Bible you hold reflects the widely understood consensus of what the Scriptures are. You don't have to worry because the consensus is very broad. But once in a while, we find a passage about which there was some disagreement because some manuscripts contained it and others did not. The question becomes, what do we do with a passage like this? And therefore, you have the result. Some put it in brackets, some just leave it in the passage, some put it at the end of the page or the end of the gospel. The New International Version leaves it where it is, but puts it in parentheses, which leaves us with the question, what do we do with these verses? The easy way out is to follow the leading of whatever translation you happen to be reading, but here's what I think. One, through the years, the church has been unable to shake this story. It's part of our history. We know it. We love it. Two, the story seems to be consistent with the behavior of the Jesus we know. And three, through the centuries, this passage, along with the rest of Scripture, has been important to the church as it worshiped. As a result, I understand the arguments about whether or not to include it in the main text, but I have no compunction about using it. I thought you should know it's here. And now to the good stuff. Early in the morning, Jesus came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. Jesus set up shop for the day. Word was murmured through the entire community that Jesus was back and he was at the temple. As the crowd congregated, he took his seat. Now, in our day, we preachers are accustomed to taking our positions behind the pulpit or what we've known as the sacred desk. But in his day, the rabbis, when they taught, took their place in a seat. That was the seat of authority. Speaking of good stuff, Jesus was about to begin teaching that day when suddenly there was a fracas. How do you detract attention from Jesus? Well, the scribes and the Pharisees knew they had a major distraction on their hands. Remember, it's probably early morning, but somehow the religious leaders had taken into custody a woman caught in the act of adultery, And they brought her into the temple, and they foisted her at Jesus there before the place where he sat. They threw her down in the midst of the temple comings and goings. It was as though they were saying, Jesus, you take yourself to be a rabbi, don't you? You've come into this ultimate house of worship and have presented yourself as a teacher of the law. Is that not right? You purport to have some kind of divine authority. Well, how about this one, Jesus? Every eye is on the woman. Every eye is on the accusers. Every eye is on Jesus. And the boldest and most ferocious of the lot of accusers exclaimed, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now, in the law of Moses, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What do you say? Deep, deep silence as one hardly dares to take a breath for listening to what Jesus would say. Jesus, you wanted a chance to teach the law. Now you got it. What do you say about this? There are some things about this scenario which are not in doubt. First, the scribes and Pharisees knew the law. Leviticus 20:10 said, if a man commits adultery with another's wife, that is, with the wife of a fellow countryman, both adulterer and adulteress must be put to death. Turn to page Deuteronomy 22:22, and it says, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman shall be put to death. Now, by put to death, they meant stoning. Stoning was the method of execution during which a group of people, usually the peers of the one accused, would throw stones at the condemned person until that person died. Death by stoning was prescribed in the Old Testament for a variety of sins. Both animals and people could be subjects of stoning. Exodus 21:8 tells us that. And stoning seems to be associated with sins that caused irreparable damage to the spiritual or ceremonial purity of a person or animal. The scribes and the Pharisees, in other words, had truth on their side. The woman was caught in the act of adultery, and about that, there seems to be no question. The scribes and the Pharisees lay the matter in the purest, bluntest, most unadulterated manner before Jesus. What they were saying was this: Jesus, are you going to obey the law? And to that moment they implied, so Jesus, if you dare to challenge us, are you willing to set yourself up as a greater authority than Moses? They folded their arms over their robed chests and waited for an answer. Jesus, they believed, had no way out of this one. Now, they must have had some reason to think that Jesus might go light on this woman. Otherwise, they wouldn't have raised the ruckus. They had no honorable reason for interrupting the teaching in the temple, and as the scriptures say, they were attempting to test or to trick Jesus, to catch up with him. Still, they would have followed the law. The law required that there be two independent witnesses in a capital case. Deuteronomy 17 and 19 make that clear. But the chances of actually catching an adulteress in the act were highly unlikely unless she was set up, and such a setup would make those who participated in it also witnesses to the act. In other words, the scribes and the Pharisees had the law on their side, but it is highly likely that they set up this situation, and so their hands were dirty too. These guys dragged a guilty woman into the house of holiness, having done what they did and demanded action. They gathered the congregation as a grand jury, and they made Jesus the defense attorney and demanded of him, what then, Jesus, do you say? Jesus looked as though he were buying time. He stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. What he said, the scriptures do not reveal, and we do not know, but it bought him a little bit of time, yet they persisted in questioning him. Have you ever seen a situation or been in a situation where any answer you might have given would be misunderstood? We all know that classic question, have you stopped beating your wife? To say yes means that you used to beat her. To say no means you still beat her. You don't win. No good answer. And if you try to qualify your answer, you get lost in a maze of caveats and qualifications and explanations you can't win. Jesus bent over and wrote on the ground. The scribes and Pharisees persisted, but when the time had come, Jesus arighted himself and said to them, "He who is among you without sin, let him be the first to cast a stone at her." Jesus' answer was larger than their question. They knew the law. They stated the law. They demanded that the law be fulfilled. Jesus took one step beyond the law, asking what purpose the law fulfilled. The law is designed to keep people in line, to keep them honest, to help them in their honoring of God. Adultery does not honor God. But neither did their dishonesty in bringing this woman before Jesus for judgment. They didn't want the woman judged. They wanted Jesus judged. When she was caught, she would be an exhibit before Jesus. The whole scene was not about arighting the sexual mores of the people. It was about destroying Jesus. So Jesus took one step back from the scene and drew everyone into it. You say this woman is guilty, so she is. But is your reprehensible behavior, scribes and Pharisees, without sin? You created a fence, you set things up so she would sin and be caught. When she was caught, she would become an exhibit. The whole story was not about her. The story was a setup to get to Jesus. And as a result, we have a whole collection of people who have shown themselves to be sinful before God. No wonder Jesus would say, "He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone at her." In their heart of hearts, they knew no one was off the hook. Their sins may have differed from her sins, but they were sins nonetheless. They could try to hide their sins in the cloaks of righteousness. I mean, there they were in the temple attempting to talk right and wrong and argue for righteousness, but they were caught in the net of sin too. They were no dummies. Jesus knew that too. Having drawn them into this awareness of sin, he stooped down again and wrote on the ground. He had made his case. He had nothing more to say to them. He had not addressed their question directly, but he had answered a much larger question. What do all of us do with our sin? Has any one of us the right to act as judge, to act as God? While Jesus wrote on the ground, this scribe Pharisee collective, seething in their failure, grudgingly recognizing the truth that Jesus had spoken, shuffled their well-shod feet. The younger ones, out of deference, waited for the older ones to move, and they began to move, and the older ones made their moves to the exit, and all left. As angry as they were, they had no answer for Jesus. They couldn't tell the congregation why they had not brought the male participant in this deed into the act. Look, the woman was caught in the act of adultery, in the very act, but it takes two. Where was the man? They would have had no answer for why they didn't bring the male party in, because the scriptures said both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be stoned. So as they turned heel to leave, they would have no answer for what to do with the woman now. Would they even consider what to do with him? Did they even care? Would they leave her to her own devices? They didn't care about her. They deserted her. She had merely been exhibit A in their little charade. They had no answer for that. They were unwittingly unable to respond to Jesus' challenge. They left the room and went on their way. And before long, in what seemed like an interminable silence, the space was emptied of the religious leaders. The people, if they remained, sat stock still, and Jesus and the woman, who was now in an inglorious pile on the floor, alone at the front, was asked by Jesus, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" "No one, Lord." "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, sin no more." And there you have it. Jesus never denied her sin. Jesus never denied the words of the law. Jesus simply reminded everyone what this was all about. We are all, every one of us, every last one of us, we are sinners in need of grace, and Jesus showed grace. We are so good at pointing the finger, and the world gives us plenty of opportunities. Just ask the increasingly non-Christian public what they think of us Christians. More likely than not, they will tell you how judgmental we are. And this is not to say that we should not know sin and be able to name it. Jesus told the woman, "Go and sin no more." There are plenty of black and white issues. On the Sunday closest to the 43rd anniversary of Roe v. Wade, and in a culture that gives less value to life than it should, we acknowledge abortion as sin. But those of us who have not participated in that sin, or who have not murdered, or who have not stolen, are no less sinners. We should think twice when we want to hoist a stone at someone. The Apostle Paul said it in Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We all deserve punishment. We stand under the judgment of God. Every last one of us has failed God miserably when it comes to obeying and honoring him. We all deserve the judgment that is reflected in the law. But through Jesus, in a gift both incredible and undeserved, we are the beneficiaries of grace. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. For God sent his Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. God showed his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The purpose of the law was to help us know sin as sin. The law is our teacher. It calls us to accountability. The purpose of the law was not to make us suffer. It was to awaken us. Its purpose was to call us to redemption. The purpose of God's work in history, from the beginning to the end of Scripture, is redemptive, and Jesus embodied that. One day at the temple, in front of a waiting crowd, a pitiful, adulterous woman and the teachers of the law, Jesus made this vivid, unforgettable point. Sin is still sin, but grace is grace. And grace is larger than sin because Jesus is larger than sin. Grace is grace. Stories told about Fiorello LaGuardia, who, when he was mayor of New York during the Depression and World War II, was called by New Yorkers the Little Flower because he was 5'4" and he always wore a carnation in his lapel. He was a colorful character. He would ride fire department trucks. He would raid speakeasies with the police department. He would take entire orphanages to baseball games. And whenever the newspapers were on strike, he would go on the radio and read the Sunday funnies to people. One bitterly cold day in 1935, the mayor turned up at a night court that served the poorest ward of the city. LaGuardia unceremoniously dismissed the judge for the night and took over the bench himself. Within a few minutes, a tattered old woman was brought before him, accused of stealing a loaf of bread. She told LaGuardia that her daughter's husband had deserted her, that her daughter was sick, and that her 2 grandchildren were starving. But the shopkeeper from whom the bread was stolen refused to drop the charges. "It's a real bad neighborhood," he said. "Your Honor, she's got to be punished so other people will learn a lesson." LaGuardia sighed. He turned to the woman and said, "I've got to punish you. The law makes no distinctions, no exceptions, $10 or 10 days. But even as he pronounced the sentence, the mayor was already reaching into his pocket. he extracted a bill from his pocket and placed it in his famous sombrero and said, "Here is the $10 fine which I now remit. And furthermore, I'm going to fine everyone in this courtroom 50 cents for living in a town where a person has to steal bread so her grandchildren can eat. Mr. Bailiff, collect the fines and give them to the defendant." So the following day in the newspaper, there is the report that $47.50 was turned over to a bewildered old lady who had stolen a loaf of bread to feed her grandchildren. 50 cents of that amount being contributed by the red-faced grocery store owner, while some 70 other criminals and people with traffic violations and the policemen themselves, each of whom paid 50 cents for the privilege of doing so, gave the mayor a standing ovation. Grace. We don't know what happened to the poor woman in Jesus' story. It's possible the scribes and Pharisees found her later and with less fanfare executed their judgment. It's possible. We don't know. But this much we do know. In the midst of it all, Jesus made a point we dare never forget. None of us is sinless. Every one of us is in need of grace, and Jesus is the giver of grace.